Got it.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to ASBI's Parsha class. I'm Sofia Freudenstein, the Maharat intern, and we are going to be doing our usual Parsha class method, which is we're going to look at the Parsha. We're going to look at a passage from the Talmud that quotes something from our Parsha, and then hopefully use as a way to understand our Parsha a little bit more in depth and with more nuance and meaning. I was very nervous about how Sefer Vayikra was going to go. Seems like we're going to get the job done with the Parsha this week, and we'll be done trying to figure out how to make meaning of a pretty difficult book. But I think we've done a good job so far. So I'm excited for us to continue learning today. And as usual, comments, questions throughout are very much welcome. Okay. I'm going to put the source sheet in the chat. Okay, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see? I think you can. Okay, let me know if there are any issues.
I'm good.
Okay, Parsha Behar-Bechukotai. Unlike the other Parshiyot that we've seen so far from Sefer Vayikra, this one doesn't really have any crazy things about sacrifices or the Mishkan or Kohanim. We're going to be talking about the land and also, the holiness of the land. The idea that Eretz Yisrael in particular has a different holiness status and therefore like a different set of rules and expectations of what should be going on there might feel a little bit foreign. I mean, we're all here in the diaspora this evening. Also, I think that like some of that discussion can get a little bit more difficult in a political sense nowadays when we talk about the land of Israel being more important or more significant than other places. But that seems to be the way that the end of Sefer Vayikra is operating, that there's a sense of, because we are supposed to be in Holy Land, there's a sense of heightened morality. And so there's going to be a list of things that are important to be upkeeping in the land of Israel. The one that might be the most famous of the list that come from the Parsha this week is the idea of Shemitah, right? The idea that at every seventh year, you let the land rest, you kind of give it a chance to recalibrate. And you also, all the food that you would have harvested from that year, it doesn't disappear after like for that seventh year. But now all the poor or the needy can come and take the produce on their own, which is a very sweet idea. Also the idea of the Jubilee year, right? After 7 of those 7 sets of years, year 49/50, that's even when slaves could be freed. So there's the idea of like of a heightened sense of morality that's built into the system of the land. And it's interesting because then there's a set of other morality rules that are mentioned in the context of that, that I want to look at today. I am excited, especially for this, because we're going to be looking eventually after we get through some Talmudic sources. And I got to tell a story that maybe some of you are familiar with, that you've heard of before, called Tanur Shalchnai, the oven of Achnai. But we're going to be looking at it with a totally different context than usual, that we're going to see as we build up to it. And I think that having the context of our Parsha and what's happening in our Parsha might see this story in an entirely different light. So I'm excited to do that with you. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm going to read the sources in Vayikra for us. And yeah, okay, we'll get going. Okay, this is from chapter 25, verse 14. V'chitim karum kar la'amitecha o kano miyad amitecha al tonu ish et achiv. When you sell property to your neighbor, right, because we're talking about land and land ownership, or you buy anything from your neighbor, you should not wrong one another. I guess we'll hold on to that because what does that exactly mean? Okay. B'mispar shanim achar hayovel tikne me'et amitecha b'mispar shnei tvuot karlach. So in buying from your neighbor, you'll deduct only from the number of years since the Jubilee, and in selling to you, the person shall charge you only the remaining crop years. Part of what they're trying to deal with is at the end of the 50 years of that Jubilee year, all land that had been sold goes to the previous owner, which is a really interesting idea about land ownership. So this is kind of coming into the context of that, and they're dealing with some of the back and forth around that. Okay. Yeah, Barry, can I finish and then we'll do questions? Okay.
By all means.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Lefi rov hashanim tarbe miknato, lefi me'ot hashanim tam'it miknato, ki mispar tvuot hu mocher lach. Okay. Okay, so for those years, the higher the price will go and you'll pay for it, and fewer the years, the lower the price. For that, you're being sold as a number of harvests. Okay, I'm not really an economics expert, so I don't even know fully what that means, but that's not the point. We're going to go to that Velo tonu isha amito v'yaretam Elohecha ki ani Adonai Elohechem. Do not wrong or mistreat one another. And you should fear God because I am the Lord your God. Vasitem chukotai vet mishpatai tishmaru. Vasitem otam ve'shavtem ala aretz laveta. You should do my rules, my statutes, and you should keep them and do them. And you will, if you do them, you'll be able to dwell in this land in security. V'natna ha'aretz pirya v'achaltem lasova ve'shavtem laveta alaha. And if you do them, the land will give you its produce, and you will eat it in its as being sustained, and you will be full, and then you will be able to dwell there in security. So it seems here what is happening is kind of like I was saying before. There's a sense of I'm trying to think with the right word, like symbiotic relationship of like the more you do good mitzvah, the more the land is going to do well. There seems to be a direct correlation between the good acts that you do and then success in the agricultural sense and also in security. And this idea that you should not do wrong towards your fellow, that seems to be really important. I'm curious what kind of wrong you think is being talked about here. But before we get to that, Barry, did you want to ask a clarification question?
Yeah. Back when you were talking about the Jubilee, and you said, I thought you said at the end of the Jubilee period of the 50 years, something would happen, or you would do something, or you could do something. And I was thinking that I wanted a point of clarification as to the timing. I thought it was at the end of the 49th year, and that into the 50th year on basically Yom Kippur, is it? There's tekiah, or there's a shofar blow, and an announcement that is Jubilee year.
Yes.
So, but I thought that was when the Jubilee year commenced, as opposed to at the end of the 50th year, because the 50th year itself would be the Jubilee year. 49 years would be the end of the 7 Shabbatot Smichot cycles.
Yes. So
I was looking for clarification from you on that time.
It is confusing. The recommendation I'd have for getting more clarity on it is reading all of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, which is not actually helpful. But basically the idea is that, like, yes, what you were saying is correct. There are multiple verses that kind of deal with this contradiction. Like, is it 49? Is it 50? Masechet Rosh Hashanah is dealing with trying to bridge the two and saying that it's leading into the 50th year. So you have part of the 49th year leading into the 50th year, and kind of the math gets kind of wonky. So I guess my answer to you is, wanting clarity is a really fair point, because I do not think it's incredibly clear. And we also don't live in an agricultural society now where we know like what crops would have been like more prominent at the end of a season versus the beginning of a season. But I believe the first parak of Masechet Rosh Hashanah deals with a lot of this, and I recommend. I'm happy to like do some skimming for specific passages, and I can send them to you if you want. If
okay. So in other words, if outside of class, basically, you and I.
Yes, it's complicated. If I had a calendar year chart ready for you to go, we could explain all the
absolutely
details.
It's complicated, and I look forward to learning from you. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to put a link in the chat again to the source sheet, because we had some newcomers, which is fun. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? What do people think maybe about the idea of lo tonu ishet amito? I feel like a lot of people are very into not wronging one another. I don't think this would be so controversial. Anyone other than Barry want to start us off?
I'm good with that. Come on, you guys. Jump in. The word is fine.
All right, Barry, go for it, and then we'll move on.
I see a few ideas, that a few topics, a few things that could be in question. We've been cautioned before on fair measurements. Some say, I think there's a Rashi commentary, that it was the failure to give fair measurements to the group that was trailing behind our people, our people behind our people who were trailing along, and they were the ones who were attacked by Amalek. So there's no question that the importance of measurement is important to God, being fair to one's fellow person, as you say, Sofia, and that's prevalent, and it goes to all facets of our life, right? It encroaches it attaches to all things in our lives, to be fair to our fellow people. And so fair measurements, and land is something that can be measured, and crops and output. I share your confusion about the complexities of the agricultural nuances, but I think it's absorbable by even a layperson such as I, that a land that yields a certain amount of crops on an average, and when God blesses it even more, that should go into the concept of how you calculate buyer-seller proportions, from one Yovel year to the next, and what's in between, and how much yield you're going to get, and that takes us right back to Bereshit, because in my mind, because it's the land, and the land is holy, and I am reminded that the concept about the land and all creation are God's possession, and we are tenants, we are consumers, we are users, but we are not owners. We are here at the grace of God, and that means that everything that we get to use that came from God's creation is blessed to us, and we should treat it that way. And then it's Eretz Yisrael, or the land that was covenanted 3 times to each of our 3 forefathers, was holy, and it was so holy that the occupants at the time, back in Bereshit, back at the time of the covenant between the pieces, there's commentary that I read, I want to say Rashi's commentary, that that our people would be strangers for 400 years, right? And that goes back to the time of the birth of Yitzchak, and it carries forward. It wasn't all just in Egypt. It was everywhere since Yitzchak was born, because we were not in our own land, and that we couldn't get the land until the sins of the occupants ran their course. So peoples in lands at any given time are not booted from those lands by God. The covenants that we could come in and occupy, cross the Jordan and occupy this land, and that God will fight for us to take over the land and to settle it. But we couldn't even do that until the sins of the occupants ran their course. So that tells us how important that God is considering the people who live in the land, but how precious the land is to those people, and when it's our turn, to us. And so it's all complicated, it's all mixed in together, and we got to be fair in measurement, in treatment, so that the land shouldn't spit us out somewhere along the way, as I've seen in somewhere along the way in the Torah. So
amazing.
I think I got that off my chest. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. So what Barry points out is that in other parts of Vayikra that we've seen, there have been discussions of what it means to not mistreat, and measurements and ethical treatment in business are some of those things. And they're definitely connected to land, because there's the buying and selling of land. And we definitely have precedent for this idea that sin and getting kicked out of lands are connected, and therefore doing mitzvot and staying in the lands are also connected. So yes, to all of those things. Amazing. Okay, we're gonna move on to the Gemara, because that's where things are gonna take a turn. Okay, so we're reading from Bava Metzia. Bava Metzia is tort law, like all of the Bavas, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Batra. The Bava means gate, so Bava Kama is the first gate, this is the middle gate, and then Bava Batra is the last gate. Bava Metzia in particular is a lot about business tort law, tort law is damage, but there's a lot of stuff about business in particular, and negligence, and a lot of stuff about land and transferring of land. So it's interesting because it's going to take a turn in how we talk about things, and we're going to get to our story. So I'm going to read the Mishnah here for us. Okay, Bava Metzia says, just as there's a prohibition against exploitation, ona'ah, that was what we saw before, mistreating, in buying and selling, so there is ona'ah in statements, i.e. verbal mistreatment. So before we were trying to figure out what kind of mistreatment were we talking about, what the Mishnah here is saying is that we in Bava Metzia talk a lot about buying and selling, but there also is the kind of exploitation in statements. The Mishnah proceeds to cite examples of verbal mistreatment. One may not say to a seller, "For how much are you selling this item?" if he does not wish to purchase it. He thereby upsets the seller when the deal fails to materialize. Okay, so this feels like a little bit of a mixture of the buying and selling and then in statements, right? Like, don't be careful not to like mistreat people in business, lead them on to make certain kinds of purchases and raise and lower prices. The Mishnah lists other examples. If one is a penitent, another may not say to him, "Remember your earlier deeds." If one is the child of converts, another may not say to him, "Remember the deeds of your ancestors," as it stated, "and a convert shall you neither mistreat nor shall you oppress him." So this, I feel like, takes a turn. Before we were talking about business, and then we shift to how we treat others and also their pasts and who they've come to be. We don't remind someone who is like now returned to Judaism, that they didn't do necessarily good things in the past. And if someone's a convert, we're not supposed to say, "Oh, let's talk about your past and how you got here," and then they provide a source to back it up. And I find this interesting, right? Because it seems like in the Bava Metzia realm, we've been talking purely about business, and then all of a sudden it becomes this way of talking about how we treat others. And there's going to be a few other examples before I open up to discussion. This is from the Gemara. Okay, the Gemara. The sages taught, "It is written, and you shall not mistreat one man, his colleague, and you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God." That was from our verses above. The Tana explains, the verse is speaking with regard to verbal mistreatment. The Braita proceeds, "Do you say that it is speaking of verbal mistreatment, but not dvarim, or perhaps it's speaking only with regard to monetary exploitation, but not mammon?" So now they're struggling with our verse. Was our verse talking about mistreatment in money or in the way that we speak with other people? When it says in the previous verse, "And if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold or acquire from your colleague's hand, you shall not exploit his brother," monetary exploitation is explicitly stated. How then do I realize the meaning of the verse, "And you shall not mistreat one man, his colleague"? It's with regard to verbal mistreatment. So this is a technical, like Talmudic way of thinking, right? Which is when they're trying to figure out if something is A or B, if they have two verses that sound similar, the first thing definitely is talking about A, so therefore they assume that the next one must be talking about a different thing, which is B, which is happening here. So because one verse is explicitly in the context of business, you're going to think the Torah does not waste words. That's a concept in Rashi, but it's a really important exegetical, which is like a fancy interpretation word, for how Gemara works, which is that if something sounds repetitive in the Torah, it must be that's coming to teach you something new. And that's part of this A-B kind of learning. So the idea is that if one is explicitly about exploiting in monetary sense, then therefore this one's coming to teach us about exploitation in another sense. So that's that. And then we have a little bit more of an explanation or more detailed version of the Mishnah. How so? If one is a penitent, another may not say to him, "Remember your earlier deeds." So if someone's about tshuva, we don't say, "Let's talk about all the things you did before coming here." If one is the child of converts, one may not say to him, "Remember the deed of your ancestors." If one is a convert and he came to study Torah, one may not say to him, "Does the mouth that ate unslaughtered carcasses and animals that had wounds that would have caused them to die within 12 months and repugnant creatures and creeping animals come to study Torah that was stated from the mouth of the Almighty?" So this is an even sharper version of what was said in the Mishnah, which is that if there's a child of converts, we don't talk about their past. And specifically, if there's a convert that came to study Torah, you wouldn't kind of have this, I would say, almost like holier than thou way of talking, of saying, "Oh, all of these, you used to do all these things with your mouth. You got to eat all of these unkosher animals. And now you're going to use that same mouth to study Torah." I feel like this reminds me of the conversation we had last week about Kohanim, where like it seems too specific of an example from the Gemara to think that this is not in reference to something that must have happened before. Right? Like, okay, this is a very creative diss, but like, where did this come from? Unless this might have been a really problematic way that we were talking to converts. We talked about conversion in this class before and about how often there's a lot of difficulty around that as a community and how we should be talking to people who come and join our community. How do we truly be welcome? So this seems like a useful crash course on how to be kind. And it's also really beautiful that this is something that's of such importance that we're making mistreatment of others an Isser D'Oraita. It's like a Torah level prohibition of something so bad. One might think that, okay, doing poorly in business or mistreating someone in business, that's like financial a financial dip, but the idea that it's actually at the same level to mistreating people in the way that we speak to them is also of such severity, I think is pretty cool. So what I think that the Baba Metzia sources here are doing is showing us the power of words in particular to mistreat, and how even in the way that we speak to each other, there's a sense of mitzvah and goodness that we should be doing, going about it. Before we go to one other example before our big story, does anyone have any comments or questions?
In my turn, everybody feel free to join.
I was just gonna,
yeah, go for it.
I was gonna comment that, I mean, all of these is really, especially that, if you're gonna go into a shop and ask someone about their wares, how much is this? And then you don't buy it, you're being inconsiderate of that person's feelings. Like that person might think, oh, why didn't they buy it when you had no intention to buy it in the first place?
Mhm.
And I mean, this may be like, oh, this is a big jump from this, but it's really just being considerate of someone's feelings. I mean, you're going to comment about their history, that you're being inconsiderate of their feelings. That's all.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
We have a hand.
Yeah. Molly, I got confused by the clapping emoji. I thought it was a hand raise, but I see it was just a clap emoji. Barry, go for it.
I think, Dina made a great point. What I think is it's important to split the hairs on this one for me. I'm a business educated guy in the undergraduate and the master's sense, but I'm not, it's been a while, but I can tell you that I've had curiosities and I have not gone in to frivolously spin somebody's wheels, but there are times when I'm not sure I want to buy or not. And price is going to make a difference, or looking at an object, but not knowing really how it's constructed or its quality or what you're buying. And in American society, and this is important not to go too close to American law, but yet to see the differences for conversational and educational sake, that there's a caveat emptor that started off in Western society, buyer beware. So that means buyers have to ask questions. And so the intent to buy may not be at the initial stage, but just as long as you're not just going in to spin somebody's wheels is how I would rather see the application and the execution of this kind of concept. But I'm not intending to put words in God's mouth. If God means what Dina meant to mean, and what the words say here, then I'll shrug my shoulders and say, okay. But I think people should be able to ask questions before they get to the point where they decide whether to buy. And the seller should not be so eggshell skinned or thin skinned to be upset because somebody didn't buy, but rather go through the process of learning about the product, exchanging the conversation, negotiation if it's appropriate, and then coming to terms on price. And there's a few things you have to do before you get to the sale. So in my mind, so it's not black and white, but it's a little bit more gray as I think of it.
Barry, I don't think that it was saying, I wasn't really saying like you're going in and then you're gonna like, maybe. I think what this is saying in general is that you should not just like oh yeah, how much is this? In addition to like commenting on someone's previous deeds or something, all of those things. Just the whole thing is really, you should be considerate of your actions before you make an action, to not be ignorant of what you're saying might cause someone to feel something or think something. That's all.
I think also for me, I think like nowadays, I think as a consumer, I often don't feel like I need to be so conscientious because a lot of it's like big companies. But if I were to think about local businesses and like someone who I like really could have a relationship, which is definitely what the Gemara was talking about. Maybe nowadays, like we feel more distant from the people we're buying from. But like, I think that's where I could see the feelings being important. And it's good to be inquisitive. I think you're right, Barry. It's like you're not supposed to like not ask questions. But I think that there's a way of doing it that's like window shopping. And then there's a way of doing it saying like, I'm considering this, or even being upfront with the person right away. I don't know. But in order to figure out if I'm interested in this, I'm going to ask you a few questions. I think there's a way of like setting the tone that balances out both of what you're saying.
Fully embraced by both of you, what you both of you said. And also back to conversion for a moment. Conversion to me, I have come to think of conversion as definitional. If we have a system of conversion and pre-conversion, when somebody's inquiring into it, a non-Jew inquiring about how to become a Jew, there's this effort to discourage, to see how serious they are. Then there's, during the conversion process, depending on who you want to associate with and who wants to associate with you, you get into these areas of conservative conversion, Orthodox conversion. There's different qualities of meaning, strengths of conversion that I don't want to get into in terms of a detail, but just the concept that there's a process of conversion. And then the definition of conversion to me is beautiful. And we have to adopt that because it does come from scripture and it does come from God. And that is, conversion is a new birth. It draws the line and says, your past is gone. God, you have one judge and his name is not Barry, and his name is not any human being's name or her name. It's God. So when somebody actually converts and finishes the process, we have to embrace them. One law for all people. It's clear in the Torah. It's multiply said. It's reinforced. We have to embrace that, and we have to stop taking people back to a past that they cannot turn back the clock and undo. Just because they decided to convert in a certain time doesn't mean they have to carry that baggage. God says they don't have to carry that baggage, and that's good with me.
Absolutely. Okay, we could talk about all these things for so long. We still haven't even gone to the main story
I
yet.
apologize.
No, that's totally fine. It shows that there's always so much to talk about. This is still not even the main story, but I just think it's so good that we have to like read this before we really get to the main story. Which I think is like an interesting thing about how to be careful with words from a pastoral sense, and how do we take care of people. So I just want to read this and then we'll really move on. Okay, more Bava Metzia. If torments are afflicting a person, if illnesses are afflicting him, or if he's bearing his children, one may not speak to him in a manner in the friends of Job spoke to him. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and your hope the integrity of your ways? Remember, I beseech you, whoever perished being innocent, certainly you sinned, as otherwise you would not have suffered misfortune. So this might seem obvious. I guess like if you're a kind, caring person, I think there are many people in a Shiva house or a rabbi to a congregation who might just say the wrong thing. Where if you see something difficult happening to another person, you might try and provide reasons for it. You might say, oh, well, you did this bad thing in your life, or even just like, everything happens for a reason. That too is also ona'at dvarim. That is also a mistreatment of words. It's important to think about how you approach people who are suffering. And I think it's cool they're referencing the story of Job, right? Job is from the book of Job, and he suffers a lot, and his friends try and console him, but in ways that like aren't actually helpful, where they're trying to provide like a robust theology to help make sense of what's going on to him, when actually maybe the best thing to do is just like sit and be present with Job. So I think this also is like a really interesting usage of ona'at dvarim, where like mistreatment with words also sometimes means we should not be using our words, and we should just be with people who are hurting. And I thought it was like really interesting and surprisingly, I don't know, like pretty accurate to like the contemporary way we seem to be understanding psychology and like how to help people who are suffering. So I thought that was cool. So I want to share it. Okay. We can also talk about that for forever, but we're going to get to the main attraction now. Okay.
Ooh.
So this Oven of Achnai is a really interesting story. I first heard it, I think, when I was 14 on the Drisha High School program. And we were taught it as a way to talk about like what rabbinic authority is. The story, I'll summarize the chunk that we could read the whole thing, but I think that actually it's going to distract a little bit, but you're welcome to see the text yourself. And maybe some of you are familiar with the story. So the quick summary is that Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis are disagreeing about the ritual purity of an oven, right? That's the Tanur Shel Achnaya, the oven of Achnaya. Achnaya is the name of the person. Rabbi Eliezer says that it's impure, and the rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer says it is pure, and the rabbis say it's impure. It doesn't really matter who says what. But what's important is that Rabbi Eliezer gets really upset because he says, I'm totally right. And he starts performing all of these miracles to prove that he's right. And he says, if I'm right, then this river should flow backward. And then it does. If I'm right, then this carob tree should be uprooted. And it is. And yet the rabbis don't change their mind. And so Rabbi Eliezer is so frustrated. And he even gets a batful, a voice from heaven to come say that he's correct. And they're still not listening to him. And then what do they say? Why are we not listening to you? Because the Torah is lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. It is true that the Torah is God-given, and you think that a voice from heaven that Rabbi Eliezer uses to prove his point would be enough proof to show that he's actually the right one. But we have a rabbinic legislation jurisprudence, the idea of following the majority, right? If you have a minority opinion and a majority opinion, you go by the majority. So much so that if God says one answer, but then the rabbis as a majority say another, you go by the rabbis, which actually reminds me of the story that we did a few weeks ago, for those of you who were here, where we had the story of the rabbi who was looking into heaven, and he saw that God was disagreeing with the rabbis, and the rabbis also kind of won out there, which is interesting. But you think this story is like quite weird, like why this story, which often within the modern Orthodox discourse is used to teach you the power of rabbinic authority, even over God's self. Why is this in the context of verbal mistreatment? So that's what I want to talk about today. So this is the summary of what we've seen so far, what I was just explaining to you. Here are all the miracles, right? Here's the carob tree will be uprooted. The stream will turn backward. This one is also really pointed. One of the miracles he asks for is that the walls of the study hall, the Beit Midrash, will prove it. So they break and lean inward, which is like very symbolic that the Beit Midrash itself is kind of in limbo with this debate of like God and the rabbis, minority versus majority. Okay. So, and then the divine voice and says that Rabbi Eliezer is right. Okay, no, but the Torah is not in heaven. And then we have here, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah after majority to incline. We go by majority. It says so in the Torah. Therefore, we should listen to this divine voice. Okay, amazing part of the story. And then we get to like back to where we were discussing the power of mistreatment of words. Rabbi Natan's encounters Eliyahu Hanavi in heaven and says, okay, Eliyahu Hanavi, you're a prophet. You know what God was doing at that time. What did God do? And Eliyahu says, oh, God said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. It's like this funny game where God is trying to tell them the right answer. And then the rabbis are using God's Torah and being like, but you said otherwise. So it's like this very interesting, obscure interaction to be thinking about God this way. God's like laughing and smiling. Interesting. Okay, but here is where we get to the part about Onat Dvarim again. And I think often this part of the story, when talked about in the modern Orthodox discourse world, is what's skipped over because it's not really about this like larger discussion about how halacha works, but it's connected to our story. The sages said, on that day, the sages brought all the ritually pure items deemed pure by the rulings of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the oven and burned them in fire. And the sages reached a consensus in this regard and ostracized him. So not only is Rabbi Eliezer deemed wrong because he's not in the majority, but they actually undo all the things he had said previously were ritually pure, and they take them to the fire because they're like going to make them pure themselves. They don't trust Rabbi Eliezer's rulings anymore, and they ostracize him. So not only is he wrong, now he's like getting kind of kicked out of the community. And the sages said, who will go and inform him of the ostracism, right? It's not just that they're like bullying him, they're actually trying to excommunicate him. Rabbi Akiva, his beloved disciple, said to them, I will go, lest an unseemly person go and inform him in a callous and offensive matter, and he would thereby destroy the entire world. That's pretty intense. So Rabbi Akiva, who is known for being a pretty nice guy, yesterday was Lag BaOmer, and we celebrate the end of Rabbi Akiva's students dying, actually. But he was a big advocate of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. So he seems to be the right person to kind of break the news to Rabbi Eliezer, so much so also that Rabbi Eliezer could get so angry that the whole world could be destroyed, which is intense. And we're going to see that that's not an exaggeration. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black and wrapped himself in black as an expression of mourning and pain, and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits, which is the distance that one must maintain from an ostracized individual. So there are rules, right? Being excommunicated isn't just that you like don't take their rulings anymore, but you have to physically distance yourself. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, what is different about today from other days that you comport yourself in this manner? So Rabbi Eliezer realizes that Rabbi Akiva is standing far. Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. He employed euphemism, as actually they distanced Rabbi Eliezer from them. Okay, he flips it around a bit. He's saying, it seems like we're distancing ourselves from you. Rabbi Eliezer, too, rent his garments and removed his shoes, as is the custom of an ostracized person, and he dropped from the seat and sat upon the ground. It's almost like a kind of mourning to be treated this way. The Gemara relates, his eyes shed tears, and as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted, and 1/3 of his wheat, and 1/3 of its barley.
Oy.
Some say that even dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. The sages
Oy.
taught there was great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned.
Oy.
So we often don't continue the rest of the story. We usually, a lot of times it ends with God laughing and be like, oh, my children have defeated me. But the story does not end there. And actually we hear more about what this kind of ostracism does, right? Like the institution of excommunication is a thing in the Gemara, but this story doesn't really portray it in such a good light, right? Like it's showing that actually doing something like this could bring the destruction of the entire world, which I think is really powerful. And then that's then what connects us to what we were talking about before. What does onat dvarim, mistreatment via words, do? What is the damage that it can cause? Also that here, you're allowed to disagree with each other. The best part of the rabbinic tradition is having disagreements and having majorities winning over minorities, but maybe it's also about the way that you do it. That's really important. And maybe ostracizing him and excommunicating him wasn't the right way to do it. So much so that the foundations of the entire world fell apart. I feel very bad for Rabbi Eliezer in this story, right? Like even if he's the one who's ultimately wrong, I think we could all somewhat relate to what it must feel like to have a group of people that you respect and you feel like you're a part of turn away from you. You feel like the whole world is going to fall apart, and that you could have this destructive energy to destroy the entire world. So to me, I think that this is the part of the story that we often forget about, but this is what connects it to the earlier parts of the Gemara that we were seeing. And then also back to our original statement of we should not mistreat each other. Any thoughts, questions, reactions, clarification questions? It was like a pretty complicated story. Happy to hear.
Yeah.
Barry, go for it.
Anybody else want to jump in? There's a lot of meat here. So I'll go to my bottom line, if you will. The moral of this story to me, which I forgot how drastic and how harsh it becomes. But what the moral of the story to me is we have got to know when we are violating halakha and have to stand up, and there's kibud av v'em, and then there's not violating Shabbat, juxtaposed. And commentary, I want to say Rashi's commentary when I read it, was that you have to respect your parents, but not when they tell you to violate God's word about Shabbat and certain things. The moral of the story there being the respect goes to a point, but that's a context. And so now I relate that concept to this context, and I'm saying this is context between peers at different levels within a peership. I guess it's complicated, but you have this righteous Rabbi Eliezer who is a golden boy in heavenly terms, and he's carrying his gut surety, well, his reasoned surety, so far that it is up against the group of his peers, and then the group of his peers who otherwise paskin for the sake of individuals in society. So you can only go so far. And then I think Shmot, maybe there may be places, must be places in Breshit, but the ones that are obviously in Shmot are when God tells Moshe to, a part of Moshe's charge be to respect Pharaoh. And Moshe is going up against Pharaoh with God's mission to let us go, and yet speak respectfully to Pharaoh. And Moshe successfully straddled that line, successfully found the happy medium to do that. And evidently, I have to then reason that here, Rabbi Eliezer was not finding that happy medium and not finding that respect for his colleagues to straddle that line here and know when discretion becomes the better part of valor. And so the heavens appreciate Rabbi Eliezer, and he had the ability to, as Sofia well taught us, that the world could have been destroyed, but hey, rules are rules. And if the Torah is ours, once it came from Chorev to us, then if it's ours, then it's ours. Rabbi Eliezer, you gotta play by the rules, and you gotta know when to use your discretion. And you didn't, according to them, and God's children prevailed. It's a tough system. It's a tough world, but that's what I'm getting from this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that's complicated about this story. And I think I always initially read it before understanding in its fuller context. Like it seems like a really good success story for rabbinic Judaism, that like even we can sometimes beat out God. And like, I don't know, maybe Rabbi Eliezer is, he's like he almost reminds me of like the teacher's pet, like, right? Like he's like, oh, like, I'm gonna get God to like prove all of these things to show that I'm right. And we're saying, no, that's not how it works. Like our system of intellect and the sense of voting on what's right and what's wrong, like that's the right way to do it. But then it turns into like, oh, poor Rabbi Eliezer. Like as much as maybe he was that annoying guy in class and he was the teacher's pet, but like, is this what should have happened to him? Like, did we need to ostracize him? Did we need to put him in excommunication? Did he need to feel this kind of pain? Like, was that really where this was supposed to go? Maybe there's a way of still holding on to the need of the majority and rejecting minority, but then how do we do that in a way that's still kind to that person, without hurting him in this way? I don't know if initially the story was to have like people we rooted for and then people we didn't root for, but I would assume if we were using that as like the way to understand it, that we'd be rooting for the rabbis. But by the end, I feel really bad for Rabbi Eliezer. And I think that's kind of the point. Like, I think that the story is often taught to teach one thing about like how halacha works. When you look at it actually in the context of what we've been seeing it as about mistreatment via words and exploitation via words, it's really coming to teach something else. So I think that's interesting.
I have a quick question for you procedurally, Sophia, if you'll allow me.
Sure.
Class, if you'll allow me. I am missing, and if I'm missing it because of my own flaw in missing in the reading, then I apologize. But if I am missing because it's not there to be seen, I'm wondering if the sages confronted Rabbi Eliezer and said, if you keep going beyond such and such a point, we're going to have to ostracize you, and warn him about the effects of taking it that far. I'm not seeing that.
They don't say that.
And then I see that he was ostracized, and I'm thinking, how harsh is that if he wasn't warned, and he should have been warned by sages who should know better than not warn such an august person.
Right. Maybe that's the Ona Advarim, right? It's like not super clear where the exploitation, mistreatment is. Like excommunication is bad. But they bring Rabbi Akiva to tell him, and Rabbi Akiva is one of the nicer ones to tell him. So maybe like it's a little confusing because it seems to be about this issue of Ona Advarim, but it's a little bit unclear where exactly is the mistreatment happening, which is often how like tangential stories in the Gemara work, where like you can see there's a connection to the previous thing, but like not exactly sure how it plays out. And maybe it's supposed to be that vague. Like maybe that's part of the messiness of life, and that often, especially with mistreatment with words, it's going to be incredibly subjective and different every time. There won't be like a clear algorithm of like, here's the right thing to say and the wrong thing to say. You might think Rabbi Akiva going in and be like, I'll say it nicely was the way to do it, but maybe why are we ostracizing to begin with? Why do we need a messenger to explain ostracizing? Maybe we should have warned about ostracization first. So that's not explicitly written, but I think that's like a good point. And I think that the fruitfulness of having stories in the Gemara is that there's often so many different interpretive reads you could have on it that like I think that what you're saying, Barry, is totally possible, even if it's not explicitly there.
And one more quick spin, and that is in Holy Writings, in Nach, if you will, I've seen times when I learned that God backs his righteous ones, even when the play might not be normal or in the natural order. Eliyahu Hanavi is one of them, and others in certain select cases where they've asked for things to happen, and this is a clear example of those kinds of things to me. I forgot this story, but I'm seeing it now. That when some of these righteous Nevi'im and righteous sages take stands, God backs his righteous ones sometimes. It's a wonder to me. I mean, I'm glad to see that, but yet there are times when God respects his creation in terms of us.
Yes. Also, I mean, Rabbi Eliezer can't just burn things with his eyes. Like that's also some kind of like divine thing. It's like one wonders how God is,
sure,
whose side God is on throughout all this. Does anyone else have any more comments before we go to the last source? Okay. So I really recommend this article. I took the paragraphs that are articulating basically what we've said already, but I want to say it again. I also want to tell you a little bit about what Miriam Gedweiser actually says in the rest of her article. So hopefully I can get you to listen to it or to actually take a look. Miriam Gedweiser is someone I know, so that's like really fun. She teaches at Ramaz High School. She's just taught Talmud there. In New York, and also she is the head of the Rosh Beit Midrash, or the head of the Drisha Summer Kollel here in New York, and she knows a lot of Torah, so it's fun to like get to quote someone that you know. Okay, so she says, sometimes returning to a familiar text uncovers something new. In this essay, I hope to re-examine the story of the Avnei Achnai, the Lo B'Shamayim story on Bava Metzia, which has become a staple in many educational settings and is likely familiar to many readers, and uncover a layer that has not, to my knowledge, received much attention. Examining the larger surrounding sugya as a whole reveals a complex, multifaceted commentary on gender roles, interpersonal relationships, and the perils of sacrificing ethics for law. More recently, it has also become increasingly popular to read the story in its larger literary context. The story appears in the middle of a longer sugya about onat dvarim, verbal oppression, and continues past Rabbi Yehoshua's declaration to describe the emotional devastation experienced by Rabbi Eliezer after he was rejected by his colleagues. In this context, the protagonist is Rabbi Eliezer himself, and the story, read to its completion, focuses on his pain and its destructive consequences. This approach is exemplified by and generally traceable to chapter 2 of Jeffrey Rubenstein's Talmudic stories. So I felt like this was helpful to bring to you so that you could see that I didn't just make it up, that she's talking about it. I think also what I think is cool is what she's doing is she's recognizing how we often, for people who knew this story before, there's actually a really amazing music video of this story I could send by the group called Godcast. They have a song called Lo B'Shamayim, which is about this story, and it's animated and it's very cute. So I can send it if you're interested. But often that story is told standalone. We don't think about it as like, actually, this is really a story about Rabbi Eliezer and the pain that he experiences. Something that she brings up also in the whole article, and this is why I recommend it, is sections that I skipped talking about the issue of onat dvarim. Is there's a lot of discussion about how you can mistreat your wife if you say bad things to her, which is like difficult because a lot of it has to do with like, oh, women are so sensitive. If you say something, they're gonna cry, which is a little outdated in how we talk about these things. But it's interesting that there's like a whole section about that that comes right before the story, in between like the sections that we just read. And then another part of the story that I didn't even share with you is at the very end of the story, Rabbi Eliezer is so distraught that his wife, whose name is Ima Shalom, tries to get involved And the way that Miriam Gedweiser's reading is like, this is not just a story about how halacha works, but this is a story about how mistreatment of words work, and also how women are perceived in light of sensitivity and how we speak, and how the Gemara understands that. So hopefully that's enough of a plug for you to like have to read it, because I think she's doing something really interesting there. But I hope, and I'll stop sharing at this point so I can see you. Okay, great. I hope that seeing this this story of the Oven of Achai, if you've seen it before, hopefully at least in a new light, and if you haven't, it's just a really crazy, interesting story. I hope that seeing that in the background of this idea of lo tonu isha mito, we should not mistreat others, that was in this parsha. I feel like it's like a whole other world that opened up when you read it in the context of the parsha. You go, okay, it's probably talking about business ethics, probably talking about buying and selling land. That makes a lot of sense with the context. But now with this as the Talmudic background, I feel like a whole new world opened up, which is like, what does it mean to mistreat others? And maybe in business, it can feel a little bit cold sometimes, right? Like, of course, part of business is just like being invasive and asking questions, but also, like Dina said, sometimes also business is about like interpersonal relationships, and feelings can get hurt. And then how that extends to like this larger question of how do we relate to each other in ways that are kind and don't hurt each other, and what that pain could look like. If you are hurt, it could destroy entire worlds. I think is really powerful. So that's what I have to offer for you for the Parsha this week. I'm happy to hear any thoughts or questions, but otherwise, that's it. So last chance.
I'll offer a personal one, but I'll wait my turn if any of you ladies want to chime in, please.
Did anyone else want to share before Barry?
Ooh, the silence is deafening. Come on. Okay.
Go for it.
My thought is that Dina and Sofia have done well by me to remind me of certain things with the spins and with the language and with the context, that business is just a subset of community and a subset of life itself. And that from the heavens down to the deep crouching below, or whatever you want to call that the Yitzchak wants to bless Yaakov with. And it's the phrase, the cliche, the adage that the pen is mightier than the sword applies to the mouth as well. And I've learned by experience, and sometimes by sad experience, and learned humility along the way, that it's so easy for one who doesn't hold his or her tongue and think before attach the, as my law professor used to say, attach my tongue to my brain before I speak, that you can hurt somebody's feelings. And it can be anybody from a stranger to somebody dear, and they're all the same in terms of deserving respect. And we have to watch our words. We have to watch what we say. And when I say we, I mean me. I've learned the hard way that I have violated that principle too many times to count, to my embarrassment. And I'm humbly displaying it to this class to tell you how strong this Parsha in this area goes and how well you did by me. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other last chance? Oh, Mina, I'm reading your comment in the chat. In the Torah, we are told to honor our parents, but yet Michal and Yonatan went against Saul's orders to protect David. Had they followed their dad's orders, we would have missed out on what David did for Israel. Yes, competing values and ethics. Okay.
Does that lead to an interesting question about even king, not a king aside, but role? That there's a fine line and a confusion and a complication between roles and the interplay between the people. So children and parents is not always children and parents. Sometimes it's subordinate to king or some. I mean, human kings make mistakes too, and sometimes the kids, if they do it respectfully, see, there's a level of respect. If they do it respectfully, are doing the king a service. And if they do it in private, they can do them a service, as long as they don't do it in front of the community and in front of a group to shame whoever they're disagreeing with. I think that's where Moshe learned his harsh lesson. He's had criticisms about us along the way with God, and God has dealt with him and wisely. And yet, when he did it publicly at the rock of the water, that was too harsh publicly to let go. And Moshe paid a dear price because of his strata, because of his status before us. He had a high level to meet, and he violated that in public. So got to watch what you're doing. So I think the kids that do it in private are okay if they do it respectfully, but you gotta know when.
I think, and this will be the point that we wrap up on, is this idea of like, right, do not mistreat others, and the idea of like roles and relationships and context. Like, on the one hand, we could be frustrated that there isn't explicit rules. Like, what do you mean don't exploit? Like, tell me how not to mistreat. But I think that so many of these things are so interpersonal and subjective each time, and like require their own set of like understanding of rules each time, that like this is the charge for us to take each of those interactions seriously. And we can see, like, right, like even with Rabbi Eliezer, right, like there's a time and a place for excommunication. There's a time and a place, like he was wrong. But that there's so many layers for us to take into account for how to be kind to each other. So that, I think, is the ultimate charge, is to be able to think about it from many angles. What is the best way to be kind to each other? And so
Like
hopefully that
dancing
can
on a
be our
tightrope.
takeaway for this evening.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you. Thanks
Sure.
for spending your evening with me, and hopefully see
Great
you.
topic, and thank you for reawakening me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank
Amazing.
you.
Have a good evening.
Take care,
Bye.
everybody.